After discovering my elderly mom in tears over constant HOA harassment from our power-hungry neighbor Julia, I knew I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I decided to put my multi-millionaire resources to work, uncovering the corrupt secrets that were quietly destroying our peaceful community. But when my investigation revealed something far more sinister than petty rule enforcement, I had to ask myself, would Julia's reign of terror finally meet its match against someone who could truly fight back? The day everything changed started like any other Sunday morning. I was video chatting with Mom as she proudly showed me her award-winning roses, the same garden she had lovingly tended for 30 years in our quiet suburban neighborhood. That's when I heard a sharp voice cut through the call. "Excuse me, but those roses are clearly violating Section 8.2 of the HOA bylaws." Mom's hands trembled as she turned the camera. Standing there in her perfectly pressed beige pantsuit was our new neighbor, Julia. In one hand she held a measuring tape, and in the other her phone, already snapping pictures. I watched helplessly as this woman, whom I had never met, lectured my 72-year-old mother about how her beloved roses were exactly half an inch too close to the sidewalk. "I've just been elected HOA president," Julia announced with a smug smile, waving her measuring tape like a weapon. "And I'm going to restore proper standards to this neighborhood. You have 48 hours to move these roses back or you'll be fined $100 per day." I tried to stay calm. "Mom, don't worry, I'll handle the fine." Running a successful tech company meant I could easily afford it. I figured throwing money at the problem would make it go away. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs. The roses were just the beginning. Within a week, Julia found 3 more violations. Mom's vintage mailbox, the one Dad had installed before he passed, was suddenly not up to community standards. Her wind chimes, used to track wind direction for her gardening, were labeled as noise pollution. Even her cherished garden gnome collection, gathered over decades, was deemed tacky lawn ornaments that needed immediate removal. Each morning, Julia patrolled the neighborhood with her ruler and camera in hand. She stopped at Mom's house longer than anywhere else, taking measurements and photos from every angle. Other neighbors started whispering about how she seemed fixated on our property, but no one dared stand up to her. They had seen what happened to the Johnson family when they questioned one of Julia's violations. Their appeals mysteriously disappeared, and their fines doubled. I was in the middle of a massive company merger, flying between meetings in different cities. Every time I landed, another email from Julia arrived with a new violation notice. Mom tried handling it herself, but her arthritis made it difficult to keep up with Julia's endless demands. She started skipping her beloved garden club meetings, too embarrassed by all the violations. The breaking point came when Mom called me in tears. Julia had posted photos of our non-compliant property on the neighborhood Facebook group, calling it an eyesore that was destroying property values. Seeing my mother's garden, her pride and joy, labeled as a neighborhood disgrace, broke something inside me. What Julia didn't know was that while she was playing dictator with her measuring tape, I was finalizing the sale of my company. She thought she was dealing with a busy son who would keep paying fines to make the problem disappear. She had no idea she was poking a bear with the resources not just to fight back, but to completely change the game. That night, as I booked a flight home, an email from Julia arrived. Attached was a contractor's quote for mandatory landscaping improvements totaling $23,000. She had even provided a list of approved contractors, all coincidentally charging 3 times the normal rate. I smiled as I typed my response. "Dear Mrs. Julia, I'll be addressing these concerns in person. See you soon." Little did Julia know I wasn't just coming home with a checkbook. I was coming with a plan. Her perfect little power trip was about to meet its match. The next morning started with another certified letter in Mom's mailbox. My heart sank as I watched her hand shake while opening it. The 5th notice that month. Julia had ramped up her campaign against us. This time, she claimed Mom's American flag was mounted 2 inches too low and that we had exactly 48 hours to fix it or face a $500 fine. I helped Mom into her favorite chair and made her some tea as she told me about yesterday's incident. Julia had stood in our driveway for 30 minutes, taking photos of Mom's roses and measuring the height of each bush. When Mom tried to ask what she was doing, Julia snapped, If you can't maintain your property to HOA standards, maybe you should consider moving to a retirement home. The next day, flyers appeared in everyone's mailbox announcing an emergency HOA meeting to address serious property violations threatening our community's values. Julia had carefully timed it for when I was supposed to be in Japan closing the biggest deal of my career. But what she didn't know was that I had been secretly recording every interaction and keeping a detailed log of her harassment. That afternoon, while helping Mom with her garden, I noticed Julia hosting what looked like a tea party in her backyard. Mrs. Anderson and Mrs. Thompson from the HOA board were there, along with several other neighbors. Through the fence, I heard Julia's voice cut through the air. "It's such a shame about Eleanor's house," she said, shaking her head. "My realtor friend says properties like that could drop our home values by 15%. That night, I checked Mom's security cameras and discovered something infuriating. Julia had been sneaking onto our property at night, moving Mom's potted plants slightly over the property line, then taking photos the next day as evidence of violations. My blood boiled, but I kept my cool. I needed more proof. The following week, while Julia was at work, I hired a professional landscaping company to completely redo Mom's garden, every inch perfectly aligned with HOA specifications. I memorized every rule in their 87-page handbook. The look on Julia's face when she came home was priceless. She stood in her driveway for nearly an hour, desperately measuring and photographing, trying to find violations that no longer existed. But Julia wasn't done. She started posting about Mom in the Facebook group, claiming she had seen rats near our bird feeder. When neighbors defended Mom, their posts mysteriously disappeared. Soon, anonymous complaints about their own property started appearing in their mailboxes too. I knew I had enough evidence to take Julia down, but I wanted to make sure she could never do this to anyone else. I reached out to my old college friend Karen, now a top real estate lawyer, and set things in motion. We requested HOA financial records. Julia tried to block us, claiming they were private, but Karen knew better. These records were legally required to be available to homeowners. What was Julia hiding? A private investigator uncovered Julia's secret deal with her brother-in-law's construction company, forcing homeowners to use his services at 3 times the cost. Worse, she had embezzled over $50,000 from HOA funds for emergency repairs that never happened. I scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office. This wasn't just HOA bullying anymore, this was criminal. At the next HOA meeting, I laid out everything: financial fraud, selective enforcement, abuse of power. The room erupted. The board voted Julia out immediately. 3 weeks later, she was arrested for fraud. Today, the HOA has new leadership. The recovered funds were used to create a homeowner assistance program. Mom's garden is thriving, her wind chimes are back, and her gnomes have multiplied. As for Julia, the last time I saw her, she was loading a moving truck. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just winning. It's making things right. Mom's fixed income couldn't handle another unexpected expense. That evening, as I comforted Mom and promised her everything would be okay, I noticed something odd through our kitchen window. Julia was having another backyard meeting, but this time with people I'd never seen in our neighborhood before. They were passing around papers and pointing at different houses on what looked like a property map. I couldn't prove it yet, but something bigger was going on here. This wasn't just about garden gnomes and paint colors anymore. I rescheduled my Japan trip. My mom's house and our entire neighborhood needed me. Julia thought she was dealing with a busy son who would just keep paying fines to avoid confrontation. She had no idea that I'd been quietly building a case against her, or that I had the resources to fight back in ways she couldn't imagine. As I watched her meeting through the window, my phone buzzed with a text from an old friend at the county records office. What he'd found about Julia's past HOA dealings made my jaw drop. The moment I walked through Mom's front door, my heart shattered. There she was, sitting in her favorite armchair, hands shaking as she held a bright red notice. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and her beloved garden gnomes were lined up on the dining table like tiny soldiers about to be sent into exile. "I tried my best to keep up," Mom whispered, her voice breaking, "but my hands just won't cooperate anymore. She showed me her swollen fingers twisted by arthritis. The final warning notice threatened to put a lien on her house, all because her shrubs were 2 inches taller than Julia's arbitrary neighborhood standards. I sat down with Mom, looking through months of HOA violation notices. Each one was pettier than the last. The brick border around her flower bed was not the approved shade of red. Her wind chimes were causing a noise disturbance. Even the bird feeder was deemed an unsightly attraction for wildlife. While comforting Mom, my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. Julia had been busy. She had gone door to door with a PowerPoint presentation showing how Mom's neglected property was supposedly dropping everyone's home values by 15%. She had even used photoshopped pictures, making Mom's perfectly maintained garden look overgrown and wild. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how Julia targeted Mom right after I left for my company's biggest deal overseas. The timing was too perfect. A quick social media search showed Julia following my business news religiously. She had even commented on articles about my company's growth while simultaneously harassing my mother. The next morning I made some calls. My company's sale for $89 million had just cleared, but I kept that quiet. Instead, I hired a professional landscaping team to document every inch of Mom's property. They took detailed measurements, photos, and videos proving all her maintenance was well within the original HOA guidelines that Julia had quietly changed without proper homeowner approval. But Julia didn't waste any time. By afternoon, she had called an emergency HOA meeting for the following week to discuss immediate action against property violations threatening community standards. She even hired security to block Mom from attending, claiming her presence would be disruptive. What Julia didn't know was that I had already spoken to 3 law firms specializing in HOA disputes, pulled the property records for every house in the neighborhood, and requested every HOA financial record for the past 5 years. Most importantly, she had no idea that her perfectly timed harassment campaign had just picked a fight with someone who had the resources to dig deep, really deep, into every decision she'd ever made as HOA president. I watched through my mother's kitchen window as Julia strutted down the sidewalk, measuring tape in hand, taking photos of Mom's rose bushes with a smug smile on her face. She was so busy documenting minor infractions that she didn't notice the private investigator's car parked across the street or the camera capturing her every move. The HOA meeting was in 7 days. Julia thought she was about to claim her biggest victory yet, but I had a feeling those 7 days would uncover exactly why she was so desperate to force my mother out of her home. Something wasn't adding up about her sudden interest in this particular property, and I was going to find out what it was, no matter the cost. I couldn't sleep that night after seeing Mom cry. So, I started digging through every HOA document we had. Something felt off about how Julia targeted certain neighbors but ignored others. The next morning I made some calls to my old college friend Karen, now a top real estate lawyer, and set things in motion. The first red flag popped up when we requested the HOA's financial records. Julia tried to block us, claiming they were private, but Karen knew better. These records were supposed to be available to all homeowners. What was Julia hiding? I hired the best private investigators in town. They discovered Julia had a special arrangement with her brother-in-law's construction company, Wheeler's Perfect Homes. Every time she found a violation, she forced homeowners to use his company for repairs. At 3 times the normal price. The more we dug, the worse it got. One elderly couple, the Andersons, lost their retirement savings after Julia made them replace their entire roof for a single loose shingle. The Garcias had to take out a loan to redo their perfectly good driveway because it was the wrong shade of gray. Meanwhile, Julia's best friend, Susan, had a rusty car sitting in her front yard for months. No violations there. The investigators found something even more shocking. Julia was taking trips to Hawaii using HOA money. She had been writing checks to herself from the community fund, claiming they were for emergency repairs that never happened. Over 3 years, she had stolen more than $50,000 from our neighbors. I spent weeks building a case, gathering security camera footage, bank statements, and sworn testimonies from contractors who had been threatened into keeping quiet. The whole time, Julia kept harassing Mom about her garden, totally unaware of what was coming. Then came the breakthrough we needed. One of Julia's former assistants reached out to me. She had copies of emails showing Julia bragging about how she was cleaning up the neighborhood by forcing out older residents who couldn't afford her ridiculous fines. She specifically targeted people she thought couldn't fight back. I called an emergency meeting with the HOA board members, minus Julia. When they saw the evidence, they were horrified. Many had suspected something was wrong but had been too afraid to speak up. As we talked, more stories came out. Julia had been using HOA meetings to spy on neighbors, planning her next attacks based on who looked vulnerable. The final piece came together when we found proof that Julia had changed HOA rules without proper votes, making up new regulations whenever she felt like it. She had even forged signatures on official documents. This was the final piece of the puzzle. I knew we had enough to stop Julia, but I wanted to make sure she could never do this to anyone else. I contacted local news stations, ready to expose everything if the board tried to sweep it under the rug. Then I scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office. This wasn't just mean-spirited behavior anymore. It was criminal. Just when we thought we had seen it all, my investigators uncovered something even more disturbing. Julia had ties to 3 other HOAs in nearby towns. She had been giving consulting advice on how to manage difficult residents. How many other communities had she poisoned with her tactics? The next HOA meeting was in 2 days. Julia had no idea that her entire world was about to come crashing down. As I organized my evidence files that night, Mom called me. Julia was at her door again, waving another violation notice and threatening to put a lien on the house. I smiled, knowing it would be the last time she ever harassed my mother. What Julia didn't realize was that tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be about Mom's garden. It would be about her own crime, and I had invited some special guests. The FBI's Real Estate Fraud Division. The morning of the HOA meeting felt different. My team of lawyers had prepared 3 large boxes of evidence, each one more damaging than the last. Walking into the community center, I spotted Julia sitting in her usual spot, wearing her signature smug smile. She had no idea what was coming. I began by presenting the property maps. It turned out Julia's prized rose trellis was actually 6 inches over her property line, a violation she had fined others for. The room grew silent. Then, I pulled out the financial records. 5 years of selective enforcement, waived fees for her friends, and doubled fines for people she didn't like. The whispers started, but the real bombshell was yet to come. Next, I played the security footage, video proof of Julia accepting cash from Bob's Home Repairs, the only contractor she had approved for HOA violations, the same contractor who charged 3 times the normal rate and split the extra money with her. Someone in the back of the room gasped. Julia's face turned red as she tried to interrupt. "This is ridiculous. I've only ever tried to protect our property values." But I wasn't finished. I revealed letters from elderly residents who had been forced to take out loans just to pay Julia's outrageous fines. I showed the medical bills from Mrs. Johnson, who had fallen trying to clean her gutters after Julia threatened to put a lien on her home. The room erupted. Neighbors started sharing their own horror stories. The Christmas lights they had to take down, the children's basketball hoops they were forced to remove, the garden beds they had to destroy. Years of pent-up frustration poured out. Then I laid out my plan. I had already bought 4 properties in the neighborhood, giving me enough voting power to call for a special election. The law firm I hired had drafted new HOA bylaws that would prevent future abuse. We would implement a resident review board for all violations and put in place special protections for elderly and disabled homeowners. Julia stood up, shaking. "You can't do this. I've been president for 6 years. I know the rules." "That's the problem," I replied calmly. "You knew the rules too well, and you used them to hurt people. Not anymore." The vote was unanimous. Julia was officially removed as HOA president. But that wasn't all. The district attorney's office was very interested in the evidence of embezzlement and kickbacks we had uncovered. 3 weeks later, Julia was facing criminal charges. We used the recovered funds to start a neighborhood assistance program, helping elderly residents with home maintenance. Mom's garden is thriving now, and her gnomes have multiplied. The new HOA board meets monthly, sharing cookies and actually helping neighbors instead of harassing them. Last week I saw Julia loading a moving truck. Her precious white picket fence, the one she had forced 5 other families to remove, had to come down under the new bylaws. As she drove away, Mom and I sat on the porch swing, drinking lemonade and listening to her wind chimes. "You know," Mom said, smiling at her garden gnomes, "sometimes the best revenge is just making things right." The next day we got a call from a reporter. It turned out that similar HOA corruption cases were popping up all over the country. Our story had sparked a movement, and now other communities were fighting back too. Mom's garden gnomes had become a symbol of standing up to HOA. Sometimes the biggest changes start with one person saying enough, or in our case, one retired teacher and her army of gardeners.